Hello and welcome to the Pharma Forum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. Today we're welcoming back Alice Valder Curran, our United States policy expert, to talk about the new Trump executive order on drug pricing, what's really in there, what real effect it might have. Thank you so much for joining me, Alice.
Thanks, Jonah. Nice to be here.
So the executive order, I think it's a little bit of a surprise. We were all waiting for the pharma tariff announcement to drop, and instead we get this EO that seems to address some of pharma's concerns about the IRA vis-a-vis the pill penalty. Talk to me a little bit about what you see in there, and what you think it's possibly going to lead to.
Sure. So the first thing I want to clarify for anyone who's listening is that an executive order is not a law. It's not self-effectuating. What it really is a roadmap from the president to his team, his administrative team, saying, this is what I want you to focus on and make sure you move forward in the next period of time. And so for all of the different sections in the executive order, it identifies who's responsible for doing something on a policy level and their timeline for doing so. So it's actually helpful because we've heard a lot of things from the administration around what they might be looking at, or we've heard rumors, and now we have it in writing about what those priorities are, and we have a timeline for when we hope to have something more specific from HHS or OMB or any of the other folks who are identified in the executive order as to when we can see something more concrete. On the pill penalty, which is, I think, the headline, I mean, it's also the first sort of substantive section of the executive order. It certainly is encouraging to see the administration recognize that this uneven timeline between eligibility for negotiation between NDA small molecule products versus BLA large molecule products does create perverse investment decisions. And so it's good to see the recognition that that should be addressed. I'd caution, however, that the language of the executive order talks about aligning the timelines for those two categories of products, which is not the same as saying the small molecule is going to go to 13 like the biologics. It says that they should be the same. And the reason I'm cautious about that is that the same language in the executive order also talks about the need to prevent any increase in overall spend under the program. And so any delay in negotiation and therefore, potential loss from extending the timeline for small molecules needs to be paid for somewhere else. So this suggests that we won't have an uneven or differential timeline between the two molecules. It would be great if they're both at 13. But that's the executive order stops short, certainly, of promising that. And it makes clear that that has to be done through Congress. That has to be done through a legislative change.
So they could both go to 9, or they could meet somewhere in the middle.
Or they could both go to 13, if hope springs eternal. Any of those. But what the executive order asks for is the same timeline for both. And as I said, Congress has to weigh in. This requires a statutory change. And so it's not just about what the administration wants. It's also about where Congress can meet the administration on that point.
So I want to get to some of the other pieces in here, but like you said, this is the headline. I also know that there has been some negotiation behind the scenes between Trump and pharma, and here is where maybe the tariff bit is related. Some companies are taking steps to move manufacturing, domestically, which is what the Trump administration wants. I mean, is there a sense of whether this executive order is something that is coming out of what pharma wants, or coming out of maybe what other stakeholders want?
Who knows, Jonah? I will say these are the headlines. These are the topics that everyone's been talking about. And none of these are guaranteed results. They're just areas where the administration wants to focus over the next up to 180 days. And we know the tariff side of things is subject to its own separate timeline, that report process, which is open for comment as we speak. And so, that is something that we will see more concrete action on in the very near term. We know that the administration is focused on getting that done quickly, but there are headlines, right? There are other items in here that are definitely topics that we've seen manufacturers and other stakeholders say are a priority. I want to head back to just one other point on the drug price negotiation program. We talked about the pill penalty. The other item that's in there that's sort of buried and isn't explicit, but I want to call out, is this language that talks about prioritizing for selection prescription drugs with high cost to the Medicare program. And I think that's code, because I've seen some ex posts on this from other thought leaders, is that right now drugs are selected based on their WAC volume. Their volume under the Medicare program is priced at WAC. as opposed to their actual spend under the Medicare program. And so I read this to mean that perhaps the Trump administration is going to change how they value the Medicare spend for products for purposes of ranking them and picking the top, so that they're no longer taking utilization and multiplying it by WAC, but they're actually taking utilization based on the actual spend under the Part D and Part B programs, so that they're really focusing on the drugs that actually are driving the highest spend under those programs, which is maybe a different cohort than the drugs that have higher WACs but might actually have lower gross to nets, lower net prices because of discounts that are already significant under the D program, for example. And so that would be a big change.
Yeah, and who would that change benefit, and who would it maybe negatively impact?
Would benefit the companies that have big differences between their WAC and their net Medicare prices. So under the Part D plan, products that are highly contracted with Part D plans and so have big rebates that they're paying to Part D programs, they are going to be listed as having a lower spend than products that are not as discounted to the Part D program. And so you can just have a different mix. It's certainly going to encourage more Part D discounts if you do that, because the more Part D discounts you have, the less Part D spend you're going to have, and therefore the less likely you are to be in the top Medicare spend drugs, at least on the D side. On B, it's a little more complicated because manufacturers don't give discounts directly to the Part B program. That spend is based on the discounts that they provide to the providers themselves, but the same dynamic would apply. The lower your price is on a Part B drug, in general, the lower the amount the Part B program is going to pay, and it's going to lessen your chances of being selected. The lower your price is relative to WAC compared to your competitors, maybe in that same class.
Now, so much about how the negotiation under IRA is carried out is statutory. I mean, it's written into the law. So, is this an example of something that the Trump administration could change without going to Congress, or is this something that would have to be an amendment to the IRA?
This would not require an amendment to the IRA. This is codified in regulation. And in fact, before the first round of negotiations, the regulation for this purpose under the Part D program had the valuation at the net price. The Biden administration had to change the reg to make it to value products under the Part D program based on WAC. And so this is something that the Trump administration could flip back through rulemaking and not have to go to Congress on.
Another provision that caught my eye was there's some talk about importing drugs on the state level from other countries and making that easier. First of all, I'm not exactly sure what the federal government can do there. But second of all, that seems to be completely contradictory to the idea of putting a tariff on pharma, right? To say we're going to enable importation from other countries, and we're also going to put a big tariff on things imported from other countries. I mean, how can you reconcile those two things?
There are actually a couple of components of the executive order that talk about drug pricing relative to foreign countries. The section I think you're referencing is the section 10, which is entitled Increasing Prescription Drug Importation to Lower Prices. And the statute that references is section 804 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And that section is actually limited to importations from Canada only. So that's a Canada-specific provision. Now, as I understand the way that provision has been implemented to date, it's extremely limited. And the final regulation that FDA previously adopted that defined the circumstances under which states could import products from Canada was very, very narrow. So in this, and that assumes, by the way, that Canada has excess product that they're willing to be imported into the U.S. as opposed to the Canadians keeping it for themselves and making sure that they're managing their own supply. I read this provision of the executive order as maybe asking FDA to go back and look at those regulations, see how they could expand that within the confines of the statute to revisit that rule. And so that is something certainly that the administration can do. It doesn't require a change, but they're still constrained by whatever the statute itself says. And they're constrained by the available supply and cooperation of the Canadian government in allowing those products to cross the border. And given the current state of relations between those two nations, our nation and Canada, that is certainly an open question.
What else is in here? Is there anything? I guess. Well, let's start here. If IRA is the headline, what's the subhead? What's the second most kind of interesting provision in here?
Another really interesting provision is the provision that does not talk about international reference pricing, but everyone assumes is about international reference pricing, and that's section 4 of the executive order. order. It's entitled Reducing the Prices of High-Cost Drugs for Seniors. So again, it's about Medicare, and it instructs the secretary to work through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, or CMMI, to develop a demonstration project to obtain better value for high-cost prescription drugs covered by Medicare. That's all it says in the executive order, but one of the things we've certainly heard the administration talk about, and something that the administration tried its first time around, was this most favored nations or international reference pricing idea, which the Trump administration did try in its first go round. That those efforts were enjoined by two different courts, and then the Biden administration sort of abolished that policy. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is the provision of the executive order that the Trump administration tries to use as a do-over for those efforts, using that demonstration project authority that the administration has by statute to look at creative ways to drive value. And so that's something else that everyone's keeping an eye on. Even if it doesn't reference that topic specifically, that's sort of what industry watchers are assuming that might mean if you read the tea leaves.
Let's talk about Section 8 and Section 12, the PBM stuff. That obviously is sort of politically popular, but also just glancing over, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of there in terms of what's actually being accomplished. But what do you see this executive order potentially doing on the PBM reform side?
Well, you're exactly right. It has a lot of exhortations about a direction of travel that I think a lot in industry, who certainly on the manufacturer side and the patient side of things, think is a good direction of travel when you talk in general terms about transparency and resilience of the supply chain. But this is where we have to sit around and wait, right? So under Section 8, there's 90 days to develop recommendations on what to do with middlemen and how to make it more competitive, which is an interesting reference to the fairly concentrated, vertically integrated stakeholders and the PBMs going all the way down through the pharmacies. And under Section 12, it's 180 days. And that recommendation is specific to proposing regulations around employer health plans having greater transparency as to the direct and indirect compensation that PBMs receive. So we won't know for sure what this means for 6 months across both of those provisions. But for those who are in favor of these sorts of efforts, we know that there's been legislation on the Hill that almost passed a year or so ago, and certainly there's a vehicle to resuscitate these efforts if we now, through the executive order, can get a better sense of where the administration wants this to go. So for those who are in favor of these sorts of efforts, it's a good sign that this is something that the administration actually wants to accomplish. It could give cover to Congress once we have these recommendations, certainly under Section 8, for those in Congress who are interested in this to push for it, because it would indicate support from the president. But again, we have to wait at least 90 days on the recommendations front and 6 months on the regulations front.
I mean, it's hard to imagine in this current climate anything going through Congress with bipartisan support, even things that historically we've thought have had bipartisan support, like lower drug prices and PBM reform. But I mean, is there a sense in which just because this executive order came from President Trump, it might make it harder for Congress to get some of these things there, even if they kind of maybe approved of them in theory before?
You know, this one's hard because I do think this is a topic where there is, relatively speaking, a topic of bipartisan support. But given, I think, the general sense of how hard it's going to be to get some types of legislation through Congress, one concern I have is does this become a bargaining chip across, even where you have things with bipartisan support? Is the nature of the beast now that even in those cases, whoever needs that support is going to use it as leverage for getting support on something else where you might not have bipartisan support.
Is there anything in this executive order that's just weird, that's just out of left field, or you would not have expected to see, or doesn't raises an eyebrow?
Not a whole lot. I really felt like there was stuff in here that we've heard kicked around. Some of it we've seen in the prior administration. Some is new. A couple of other, we just talked about two sections of the executive order that were linked, that were in separate sections. There are two other sections that have as their common ground the 340B drug pricing program. There's a provision, I think Section 5, for example, this acquisition cost survey. So this is the program. This is something that the Trump administration tried to do the first time around, which was tie hospital outpatient reimbursements under the Medicare program to the 340B price. And that was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that that could not go into effect because the statute, the Medicare statute, requires the secretary to conduct a cost survey before they change the acquisition cost formula. So here, the Trump administration, having learned from that decision, is saying, fine, early on, we're going to start that survey process. So we could see the administration actually going through the hoops, following the directions of the Supreme Court to do this the way that court said that they had to do so under the statute. So that's not a surprise so much as a learning from Trump 1 about if they want to make this a policy decision, making sure that they're actually running through the traps that the statute requires. And the other provision is tied to the 340B price, and that's Section 7. And that says that those entities under the 340B program that receive federal grant funding, that as a condition of their grant funding going forward, they have to pass through the discounted 340B price to low-income patients on two categories of products, insulin and injectable epinephrine. Under the 340B program, they're called covered entities under the statute. They're not obligated to pass through these deeply, deeply discounted prices that they receive. They qualify for the program based on the fact that they serve these low-income individuals, or they receive federal grant money to serve lower-income individuals, but there's no obligation that they pass on those drug price savings to those same individuals. Here, this executive order says, going forward, if you want our grant funding, you actually have to pass through those discounts on these categories of drugs. And that certainly will result in significant cost savings to those patients, to the extent that those types of grantees were not already passing through those savings. I'll say some grantees do already pass through those savings, but not all of them do, because they don't have to do that. And this certainly would make it a mandate. And so that, again, is something we heard about in Trump 1, but here they're starting early with these priorities to make sure that they can effectuate them.
And we're talking about effectively closing the 340B loophole, at least for this subset of drugs, right?
Subset of drugs and subset of covered entities. The vast majority of 340B utilization doesn't go through grantees. It goes through the hospitals that participate in the 340B program. But this is certainly a policy priority that makes good on the intent of making sure that patients receive that lower price at the pharmacy counter.
So overall, it feels like this executive order is not targeted at one particular stakeholder in the ecosystem of drug prices. It takes kind of a lot of shots at different ones. I mean, maybe that's the wrong kind of language, but it addresses problems at different points along the value chain. Thinking about my audience in particular, how do you read this if you're a pharma exec, if you're thinking about what does this mean for my bottom line? What are the relevant pieces, and how are they going to affect pharma's business, as far as just speculating?
First of all, that's a really good point. This is an equal opportunity executive order. It really does have policy recommendations for all key stakeholders in the pharmaceutical supply chain. It's not picking favorites by any matter. There are going to be policy changes here that impact everyone and impacts the revenue of everyone, from the manufacturers to the middlemen to the dispensers. So that's a really key point I'm glad you raised. If I'm a manufacturer, I'm enheartened by the pill penalty position, because then I'll have more certainty, and I certainly will lose disincentives about restoring or about investing in small molecules relative to large molecules. I might have other challenges, but I'm going to have more of a equality of at least that risk as to investing, as opposed to the other risks that you might need to manage. I'm going to be concerned about the potential for MFN and international reference pricing, because that is pretty much the third rail in our country. Because the prices that are charged here are so important to generating the revenue that makes the innovation possible. That's really, really concerning. The apples to oranges comparison of pricing processes, and access outside the U.S. to that in the U.S. Makes it just very, very hard to do a comparison. So that, I think, is concerning. But I'm going to be enheartened on the positive note again by if we actually do see movement on the PBM reform. That is something that's really, really important to manufacturers. It's hard to get that needle moved given the market power that the PBMs have on the vertically integrated side. And so to feel like you have an administration that is going to dig in and really understand what those dynamics are and try to move change is really, really encouraging.
We haven't talked about Section 13. I know that before Trump took office, pharma really thought that the FTC under Trump was going to be friendlier than under Biden. And I mean, so far, I think it has, but I mean, is there a fear of like the this anti-competitive enforcement, I know that's a big concern for pharma.
It is. I think what's hard about interpreting Section 13 is so general. What Section 13 does is direct the administration to have public listening sessions with appropriate personnel from the Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, and the Federal Trade Commission. And then it's going to issue a report with recommendations about how to combat anti-competitive behavior. So I guess the good news is that because these will be public listening sessions, all stakeholders will know what's being said and what's being recommended. So it's not going to be behind closed doors. There will be a report that's issued that will be public so that there'll be an opportunity to review that. And I'm sure to whether there's a formal comment process back to the administration, those who are impacted by it certainly will find a way, I'm sure, to feedback their thoughts when they see it. But because it's so general, it's hard to know exactly what it means. We have to watch it. If you're on the manufacturer side, what does this mean for me? But unlike so many other provisions in the executive order, which have very specific directions, you shall make prices available to patients at the point of dispensing that are at the 340B price if you're a 340B grantee. You shall find a way to align the timelines for selection for small molecules and large molecule drugs. You shall issue a survey on acquisition costs in the hospital outpatient department. Section 13 is at a very different level of specificity or non-specificity. So we certainly have to watch it, but it's unclear exactly where that will land.
Well, this has been really good. I mean, I appreciate you kind of picking this apart section by section with, maybe we should have gone through in order, but it's kind of fun to try to put the most important stuff on top. Is there anything else going on is there anything else? But, while I've got you, anything else, people who are following policy around this stuff should be paying attention to?
A couple of highlights. One is, and the first is tied to the executive order. It talks about issuing guidance around the drug price negotiation program in the near term around MFP, the drug price negotiation guidance for the third year of the program, IPAY, initial price applicability year, IPAY 2028. That's the first year where Part B, as in boy drugs, will be subject to selection. We're expecting to see that guidance anyway in the near term, May or June, if past years are any indication on timing. And so we're really watching that because that will be the first time we really see the Trump administration being able to put in a very clear way their imprint on how they think this program should run. That executive order also discussed potentially reissuing or issuing updated effectuation guidance for the maximum fair price for the first year of the program, which starts in a scant 8 months or so on January 1 in IPAY 2026. The past administration issued guidance on MFP effectuation for 2026 last year. Manufacturers with drugs in the first set of that process are getting ready to effectuate it. And so for the executive order to say issue guidance on MFP effectuation for that first year, boy, that's got to come out really soon because manufacturers are already, and CMS is already building the process for that. So I'm really interested in seeing where those two categories of guidance come out because this is such a big program and it'll really give us an opportunity to see what this administration is thinking about how they want to implement it. And the one other area I'm looking at is this reorganization at HHS, right? So we know that when Secretary Kennedy announced some of the cuts and the reorganization of the agency, they're still going through the period of what that reorganization will look like. And for those of us who deal with that agency all day long, we're also really waiting to see what that reorganization looks like and what happens to the programs that are in it. And chief among them in my day-to-day work, and for a lot of manufacturers, they're focusing on is the 340B program. The Health Resources and Services Administration, which is where the 340B program was housed, has been abolished or will be abolished, and it's going to be reorganized into something called the AHA, or I can't remember the acronym. So like the Administration for Healthy America, that's what it is. But we don't really know what that looks like either. And so as more details come about that reorganization, I'll also be looking at that.
I actually, you kind of read my mind because that's what I was going to ask about. And in particular, when it comes to the IRA, there is a lot, I assume a lot that goes into implementing this. And are we seeing kind of the staff cuts potentially impacting the speed of the negotiations?
Great question, Jonah. Anecdotally, what I've heard is that largely the drug price negotiation program team was protected, or at least protected relative to other functions. within the agency. So if they had cuts, maybe it was less severe cuts than others, but we'll have to see how it goes. But that's certainly something that industry stakeholders are concerned about, is how those cuts impact, not just the drug price negotiation program, but service delivery throughout all components of the Medicare, Medicaid, and other components of HHS.
Any thoughts about the new CMS director?
I'm looking forward to seeing what Dr. Oz has to say and what his priorities are as he implements or works with the secretary to implement, these policy priorities. It's great to have a physician leading this, but it's too soon to tell. We're just really, it's hard to believe that we're only, 3 months into this administration, given how much has happened in those 3 months, but we're still largely watching and waiting to see for substantive policy pronouncements. And so that's the same boat I'm in.
Well, thank you so much for your time again. Really appreciate your insights on all this stuff. And have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks, Jonah. I appreciate being able to be here.
That concludes this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series, at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at Pharma Forum. Thanks for listening.